Welcome to Varn blog, and we're doing a late night, well, for me, blogcast interview-ish. Partly because I'm trying to Varn blog, and we're doing a late night. Partly because I was trying to respect the This is Revolution podcast Thursday night foreign policy show. At least the public part of it and most of the Patreon feed, maybe because I was watching it, but also because a friend of mine, Camilo Gomez, was on talking about the situation in Peru. He'll be on my show, and I'm sure the focus will be different. So people should go check that out over at This is Revolution. I didn't want to impede on that tonight with an unscheduled discussion that was kind of evergreen. This probably won't go on the podcast feed. I don't know, though. I might get a route hair up my ass. Who knows? So it'll always go on the Patreon podcast feed because everything goes there, including like every scrap of everything that's ever been taken off the internet with my name on it. But yeah. So Jeremy and I I asked Jeremy earlier today if he wanted to come on and talk about, rhetorical inflation, the problems with rhetorical inflation, why I think it's particularly bad actually when the stakes are lowest is when you see the most rhetorical inflation. So the further removed people are from actual power or an actual movement, or as a movement starts to fade, what you begin to see is the rhetoric around it becoming more and more outlandish. Now, I think people realize this in regards to right-wing movements. For example, the alt-right was most powerful in its internet presence actually during the Obama years when things felt defeated, and a lot of it started out as a kind of trolling. Now, that thesis, often propelled by pre-2018 Angela Nagel, is overly simplified. There was right-wing movements, trying to capitalize on this for years. They have been specializing their message. Richard Spencer had been trying to get on the millennial Gen X rebranding of racism for a long time, actually. The alt-right was his preferred way to make right-wing thought cool again, and he got that from Paul Gottfried, who denounced him later.
Oh, he did? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So Gottfried's the one who suggested the moniker, and then actually, ironically, the alt-right had a split in 2012 with the original members going off to be different racist, and Spencer forming the racist journal Red X, as in radical. And then when liberals started using the moniker again, he actually reclaimed it. What I found interesting about that is the Trump movement actually recuperated in the way that we normally see happen to far left movements. A lot of the rhetoric of the alt-right, incorporated it, but effectively also, I know liberals don't like this, and a lot of leftists don't like me saying this, but effectively killed a lot of it. Channeled it into more mainstream conservatism where it could be tamed. Now, it also pushed the mainstream conservatives further to the right in their rhetoric, but what they actually did as a ruling party was pretty consistent with what Republicans had done, with the exception of being a little bit nastier at the border and all of a sudden losing all faith in free markets in regards to tariffs. And they weren't even consistent on that. So it was a rhetorical shift that had substance to believers in the movement. And I'm not going to say it had no political effect, But if you tried to count down what Trump got done and looked at what was unique to Trumpism and not part of the larger Republican movement, I think he got maybe two things done. And then the most wild rhetoric and accusations also came at the moment where Trump was clearly losing. And we've seen this double down in right-wing circles now, where, again, we have this core 30%, 40% of Republicans who are, into QAnon conspiracies and this, that, and the other. And the left is really worried about that, and maybe they should be, but it's also a sign of social breakdown and that their stakes are low, that there's very little that they can do. And what people haven't noticed is high money donors have largely abandoned them. Now, why is this important for us? I was reading, my friends over at Regrettable Century Podcast on their Patreon group, because we all are buskers now. We're doing a reading of of Nihilist Communism by Monsieur Dupont.
Oh, that's how you pronounce that. I was wondering.
Well, you don't trust me on pronouncing anything French, but I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce that. So what I find that book infuriating in parts and actually also very useful in parts. I always tell people to read it, but don't accept all of its arguments. But there's one section where they talk about how real world interventions in leftism had declined rapidly from the 90s to the aughts into more and more online focuses. And they were saying this in 2003 and 2009, which means they hadn't seen how much, the breakaway from Occupy and all that would reconsolidate into online activism. And as Bernie has died down, we've seen left Twitter go ridiculous.
Yep.
And in fact, the more outlandish a tweet is, the more likely it is to go viral, right? And there's a mutually constitutive feedback loop there.
Pandemic did not help this.
Absolutely not. Now, I don't want to sound like Ezra Klein or anything, but I actually don't think this is a good thing, because I don't think it's actually substantive radicalism.
It's more like frenetic. It's more like manifesting anxiety and kind of disconnection, would you say?
Yeah, it's kind of a sign of alienation and taking a political movement, which I think necessarily would not be as. I've been trying to get people to think about the fact, if their politics totally reflect their moral and personal identity, it probably is an indication that their politics actually aren't manifesting anything. Like, the more that you're devoted to politics as a source of identity and not as something that is doing stuff for change actively, what does that, where does that leave us, right? Like it leaves us in a place where we use we attach our political identity more and more to things that we used to attach to other kinds of communal forms, but we do so actually at a moment in which our politics is dying. And I say this because also you see this parallel in religious movements. As religious movements decline and grow smaller, their adherents,
how much their adherents adhere to the faith.
Yeah, well, it's not that. Yeah, their adherents become, well, they just also become more wild in their interpretations and more extreme. Look at white evangelicals right now. All right. They're hemorrhaging members left and right, but they become more and more reactionary because the only people who would stay are people who've invested enough identity to continue to escalate the rhetoric as a means of preserving their religious identity, since everything else seems to be going against it. Now, as we've seen this, we've also seen evangelicalism decline from one of the fastest growing religious movements in modern history and the developed world to one of the most fastly hemorrhaging religious movements in the development world, if we're talking specifically about white and probably Asian adherents to the religion in the developed world, and not including China, where things are a little bit more complicated. So rhetorical inflation tends to be at a time when your access to power and your ability to have stakes goes away. That's also when, like, we tend to use rhetorical inflation to police more. I mean, yes, you always have to police your movement. I mean, I'm not one of those people who thinks you don't. Like, there's always infiltrators, there's always this, that, and the other. But you'll find that this gets the most intense and the most sectarian when things are on rapid decline. People always talk about the Black Panthers, but they don't talk about the Black Panthers of the late 70s and 1980s. And the reason why is they just go into shitstorms of mutual accusations, particularly after the news, falls out about what happened in the late 60s. So everybody becomes more and more paranoid, but they also just start doubling down on kinds of politics that are more and more removed from, the broad spectrum, socialist unity, Black unity politics of the Panthers in their high point. Now, there were always divisions within the Panthers about, how racially nationalist they were going to be, how socialist they were going to be, what kind of communists they were. The Maoists tend to win out, but they were never particularly sectarian Maoists. But that didn't really matter as they got more and more removed. Furthermore, you also saw, like, a lot of people who were engaged in, like, community defense leagues became literal street gangs. We see that with the FARC. We also saw it with the Crips, whose origins were a youth community defense league set up by someone who thought they were emulating the Panthers.
Oh wow, that I did not know. Okay, that's an interesting bit of history.
Yeah. Let's see, where's this Tukey? So and that's not something that's commonly discussed. There's only one book I found on it. It's actually by Stanley Tukey Williams. And they started out in 1969. They were actually battling neighborhood street gangs. But they started trying to recruit as a kind of, like, community defense socialist Boy Scouts because of the relationship of, like, the Royals in Chicago, who had left their street gang origins into the Panthers. The Crips kind of came out of a similar thing. They were trying to get out of their street gang origins and become like a youth league for the Panthers, but they were trying to fund themselves off of drug sales, and they got increasingly divorced from their goals. I mean, it's kind of a cautionary tale, right? I actually laughed at the Adam Curtis documentary because they chose the "Let's Talk About Tupac's Mom Getting Into Crack" article when they were talking about the Panthers and the relationship to gang culture, and didn't even mention, because I'm sure Adam Curtis didn't do enough research to know that there was a both kind of less racist and more direct relationship than was being portrayed. Right. And again, the Panthers never claimed the Crips. It was not. It was an attempt by someone sympathetic to do something to carry on the legacy. But it just kind of bombed. So but the accusations about whether or not some people should be racial nationalists or communists became increasingly divisive in the Panthers themselves, and they eventually dissolved over it in the 80s. And what I didn't realize is how late that dissolution happened. I thought it was like in the middle 70s, right? But it was like
How late?
It was really late.
Wow. Well, no, how far into, if they dissolved in the Reagan era, how far into the Reagan era did they finally like break up? Because I know that up here in Portland, the local chapter of the BPP had their free breakfast and free medical clinics work, operational until like the early 80s or so.
I'm not quite sure. Let me actually double check that here. So the Black Panther political party dissolved in 1982. So the beginning of the party. However, a lot of their orgs were ran by organizations that kind of assumed their membership. And then there was a bunch of people who claimed the mantle. There were the New Black Panther Party, the New African Black Panther Party. The New African Black Panther Party is kind of the more legitimate heir. The New Black Panther Party is a split from the Nation of Islam and has like no relationship to historical Panthers.
Yeah. Which of these splits were the ones that showed up in a, God, was this last year or a couple years ago? But I remember there was one that showed up. I think it was in Philly or someplace much farther east than us, where they showed up and like was a full on. Oh, it was a full on like Instagram like photo shoot, where they claimed that they were the new version of it, and it was like some split.
It was right during the end of Black Lives Matter, and it was a very small split.
Okay.
I don't remember what they are because they all have Black Panther Party in their name, and there's with slight variations. But it was not the New Black Panther Party or the New African Black Panther Party or any of the other different splits from the Panthers. So, but anyway, to get back to this rhetorical inflation problem, like, so one of the things that we see is that accusations and policing becomes more intense, partly because you do start seeing real deviations in the down period, people losing faith, people grifting, people, but that's real. But those points of like real, infiltration or reaction become flashpoints for like trying to find people. I always talk about the Kirov murders, a murder. When Kirov was murdered, Stalin, starts this ever expanding thing that really like accelerates the purges. And in the West, we always assumed that it was a naked grab for power that Stalin had Kirov murdered. But most Sovietologists now, including ones who are right-wing, will just say, no, it does not look like Stalin did that. There's literally no evidence in the archives that he had Kirov killed. He may have cynically used it, but it had a ripple effect, right? And reading what I have read about Stalin, it seems like he really thought that a lot of the people that he was going after were actual threats, whether or not he thought they were what the threats that he said they were. Like, I don't think he believed that Zinoviev was a fifth colonist, but, he did think that there were real threats going on. And, what does that say?
It says that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you.
Right. I mean,
to quote a certain long past Pacific Northwest poet.
I don't think he really believed Bakarin was guilty. I think he believed Bakarin was inexpedient, but it's neither here nor there. These things have their own life. I mean, one of the things that you can say about the purges is that they were, broadly speaking, popular, because there was a lot of resentment of people lower in the USSR at Bolshevik leadership. There really was. Just like a lot of the cultural revolutions, which their purges are more complicated. They rarely outright executed people, for one thing. Tons of people died mostly from suicide. One of the ironies of this is like they're supposedly trying to fight Confucianism, but Confucianism is the shame-based culture that is encouraging a lot of these people to kill themselves. So that's not always true. Like Liu Shaoqi is done real dirty. He's imprisoned and not given his diabetic medication and basically allowed. He wasn't executed, but all but. And so there was a lot of that too. But it was ironically a consolidation of power, but it was also broadly popular because there was anger at the leadership in the Communist Party popularly. And it's hard to disaggregate what's cynical in that and what is kind of blind populist rage.
Yeah. Also, one thing that does a question that pops up is, can you talk about the connection, or because you mentioned the popularity of what you could call, I guess we could safely call that state terror. Of how does the popularity of state terror, or purges and shit, connect up with, say, the popularity of terror that showed up in a certain earlier revolution that happened a few time zones west of there about 100 years earlier?
I think it's very similar. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of popular excess that really does happen. One of the things that it does, though, I mean, if you map out what it tends to do, is you always see a declaiming or conservative backlash to it. Now, I actually don't think like Khrushchev was necessarily a conservative backlash, but he was a liberalizing one. And for those who think that the other faction wasn't intending to do that, Beria actually had an even more radical liberalizing denouncing Stalin plan, even though he was the primary henchman. Like, that's one of the few things that Death of Stalin actually gets historically right. So there was a lot of whatever was going to happen after Stalin died. While the purges were broadly speaking popular, the results of the purges, the overstretch of the purges, were not. I'll give you the example that in the Soviet case is like purging most of your military and having to bring a fourth of them back after accusing them of being Nazis so that they can fight, survey says, Nazis. Like, that really happened. Also, secret armament deals with Nazis made by Stalin, that also really happened. So who's the fifth columnist there? Stalin himself? I mean, like, it's easy to have a moral high horse about this. Like, you can also take this in a totally silly anti-communist route. But it's important to look at why something being kind of popular or people getting in on a popular sentiment does not necessarily mean that the broader agenda was accepted by most people who thought it was popular, or that when the results came in, when people actually had to process the results of the terror and how far it went and who it got, that the backlash wasn't immediate from some of the same people who supported it.
Oh no, what have we done?
Right. And I mean, I think we see this in Twitter mobs all, but this is why the cancel culture dialogue, I mean, I'm not saying that the cancel culture dialogue is anything like this. I'm just saying that the basic like social dynamics rhyme. And what I mean by that, well, canceling people, in so much that it actually happens, is broadly speaking popular.
Yeah,
it is.
Mass denunciation and shunning and ostracism, only not quite going to the extent of.
No one. I don't think anyone wants to kill anybody. Well, generally, they don't want to kill anybody.
Yeah, we're not quite to the extent of firing squad, at least
right.
Yet.
But I mean, like, for example, I think the Cultural Revolution stuff brought up by current, like, conservatives and even some Marxists right now about cancel culture is ridiculous. But I will say that, like, the Cultural Revolution actually, even though Tons of people died in it. There weren't a lot of firing squads. There just weren't. You know, it was mostly social shaming to the extreme and suicide. And then fights between factions afterwards that had a high body count that were allowed to happen without government intervention. There were executions, and there were, but like most of them weren't done by the states. Like if you see some, like when you hear about people getting thrown, you know, getting drowned and thrown off bridges and stuff like that, that's just popular mob violence. It's actually very similar, not even to bring up the French Revolution, it's very similar to what happened in the American Revolution. This is not to say that it's a justification. I actually think these excesses of revolution are something that revolutionaries themselves have to tamp down on if we were ever in that kind of situation, because they exhaust themselves.
Right.
What
you know, they burn themselves out. Can you give an example? Can you give an American example?
How many like loyalists did we tar and feather?
Literally.
Yeah, literally. And how many of them died? Quite a bit. The American Revolution, partly in the context of it was a war, and partly of the context is actually the popular support was more divided, was more bloody than the French Revolution, than the French Revolution's terror. The bloodiest part of the French Revolution is often not talked about. When people defend the French Revolution as less bloody than the American Revolution, they do so by excluding the war in the Vendée.
Yeah. A great book about like the beginning of total war that talks about that as predating modern conceptions of total war, as beginning from from when like Napoleon is actually setting up and gallivanting around Europe and shit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beginnings of total war actually come out of the English Civil War and the war in the Vendée and the American Revolution. And then
I was gonna say there is I can't remember who wrote it, but there is a great book. I just know that it's you can get it on your Kindle. Just something like, you know, myths of the American Revolution that actually gets into talking about how much of the American Revolution was a civil war where you had, and like you at some point you didn't even I think this is probably more of a mid-South thing, but like there are certain regions of like the borderlands in Tennessee where you had domestically born. I mean, you didn't even have there were no British troops there whatsoever, or not even British officers. You had loyalist versus revolutionary officers and troops just blasting the shit out of each other.
Well, my favorite example of this is the South. It's one of my complications to Gerald Horne's counter-revolution of 1776 thesis, because he is always talking about how indigenous groups and free black slaves were supporting the British Empire because it had a more progressive stance, which it kind of did. I mean, like the stance is, what was the Somerset ruling, which actually happens before some of the American Revolution's initial, after some of the American Revolution's initial stuff happened. So this is one of the things where I actually think objectively some of the critiques of Horne are correct. But the Somerset Revolution, the Somerset ruling is that slavery shouldn't happen on British soil because no black slaves should breathe British air. Like it's a objectively, you know, emancipationist argument, but made from a racist stand, which actually was true for a lot of the abolitionist movement before 1830. But even more so, I mean, they didn't, like, the Caribbean slave trade wasn't abolished for like 30 more years, and that was still in British control, or 40 more years. So I find that overstated. And the other thing I find, though, goes back to what you're saying, is the South, the slaveholding South, was the hotbed of loyalists outside of the Canadian border. So a lot of the loyalist forces were Southerners who were slavers, which complicates a lot of the like clean revolution, counter-revolution narrative of, you know, people wanting to argue for the revolution being, you know, a unilaterally good thing, or against it, in the Gerald Horne way.
Right.
I mean, Horne does make some good arguments in the book. I tell people to read it, but you need to read it with some more context and complications, because there's stuff I think he's objectively kind of wrong about.
Real quick, just to define, can we define in these terms what meant the South by this point? Because are you talking about more of like the Carolinas, which was more of like
the Carolinas and Georgia?
Okay, so which is not Tidewater and Virginia and in the Mid-South, which to go off of Woodward, I can't remember how to pronounce his name. Colin Woodward's kind of like 11 nations.
Yeah, but he considers the Carolinas and the Deep South kind of part of like the more reactionary part of Tidewater. Although he talks about their Scotch-Irishness being a complication. I mean, and I find that somewhat interesting, because the history of the Carolinas and the history of Georgia are actually diametrically opposed. The Carolinas start off as slavery states. Georgia starts off as a weird utopian prison colony that is anti-slavery. And then
I thought it was like a buffer thing between the Carolinas and Florida, which was Spanish.
That's also part of it. That's the reason. So whenever you talk about the origins of some of these states and the origins of something politically, you can't be unilaterally reductionist on it, right? So I have a correction. Somerset was predicated on slavery being against common law and requiring an enactment under positive law, which already existed in the United States, so it wouldn't have applied anyway. But the actual ruling wording is as racist as I said it was. Here's one of the things I'm going to like parse a little bit on Georgia, because I know it really well. The Crown let Oglethorpe set up a weird utopian prison colony as a reform colony that had an everybody but the Catholics as a buffer state, but it was anti-slavery explicitly in its charter.
And for the entire state?
It wasn't a state yet. It was just a colony of Oglethorpe.
Or just like territory outside of...
Yeah, it's the territory of Oglethorpe. It's the territory around Savannah and extending out. Because I think Carolina was still claiming a whole lot of what is now Georgia.
Okay.
And also, it theoretically extended all the way out to the ocean, but I mean by the other ocean, but no one ever enforced that.
It's a long walk.
What happened is basically Oglethorpe couldn't outproduce Charleston, and they had regular bouts of malaria, and then they gave up, and then the Oglethorpe charter was abolished, and it just became a regular southern state. And immediately, like the rest of the colonies, including some of the other ones, started bringing in slaves en masse.
Malaria outbreaks are not something they teach you about in American history class. It's kind of always like it's an over there problem, if you will.
It's funny because like that was literally one of the arguments for bringing in black slaves is like, oh, the indigenous slaves have, we didn't enslave the indigenous people here. Most of them have already died from pox,
right.
And including pox before we even got here, frankly.
Yeah. Blame the Spanish for that.
Yeah. And so we can't enslave them, and we've kind of made charters with them, and we're going to kind of respect that. Also, we die of malaria. I guess black people don't. If you read the letters, that's how they justify it. So they give up on their utopian anti-slavery charter and just become a standard Southern slavery state. That is cited as why Georgia was one of the Southern states that was really weird on a stance towards succession. It actually technically opposed it till South Carolina did it and then flipped. I don't know how true that is. I've read a lot of documents on Georgia history to try to, because I've always I really want to understand the Civil War because I think it's really important in the American consciousness. And I think the Southern recuperatists are lying, but I also kind of think the Northern progressivist narrative on it's also a lie. So
yeah, shit was a lot messier and a lot more complicated and a lot less salutary than we like to think.
So we're going off history tangents. I was going to talk about,
Sorry, yeah,
but
okay. Remember, we're talking about rhetorical
rhetorical inflation
and declining states, declining stakes.
I actually think that you can see the South is another place where you see this. As Southern identity is less and less important in the beginning of the 20th century, that's actually when you see this neo-Confederate shit really kick up. You don't see it even after the ending of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow laws. You see it in the 1920s.
Yeah, when do like the daughters of the Confederacy and all that kind of shit really? When does that really kick off? Like the
Daughters of the Confederate. They used to run a cemetery near where I lived, and I would literally laugh that they made their liberal concession of changing the pamphlets at the cemetery from the War of Northern Aggression to the War between the states. That was their progressive move. But anyway, the Daughters of the Confederacy, Daughters of the Confederacy were founded in 1926. After the beginnings of the Second Klan in 1900. So
funny how that works out. And people were like, well, hey, we take down all these cheap ass shitty sub-bronze statuary, we're fucking up our own history, blah blah blah. But
yeah, even though that sub-bronze statuary is all from like the 30s. What's interesting is that's also when you see the grand unity narrative come more and more up in America. I mean, you particularly see it after Wilson. It's a very popular narrative, and it's one that, quote, progressives held, unquote. This was not a conservative only rallying point at all.
Was this because they were like trapped in Dunning school shit too, or is it just like it was almost like this kind of like, I dare I call it like interwar consensus?
It was interwar consensus even by people like Dewey. I mean, I've been reading Lash's first book, which is on the 1920s progressive radicals. So that's like Dewey, Jane Addams, Rudolph, I don't remember, Lincoln Stevens.
Right.
And man, did those guys look bad. I mean, Dewey looks real bad, but the whole pragmatist thing comes up, and like we have to pragmatically preserve the Union, and that means making concessions to the South, to Southern elites in specific. Because the other thing that people have to remember is the South went from being the most concentrated part of the wealth of the United States was in the hand of the planter class, and the planter class alone. They were the richest people in the colonies until about 10 years before the Civil War. But the South, as part of post-Reconstruction policy, was deliberately not allowed to industrialize. And when it was allowed to industrialize, it was only allowed to industrialize in textiles. Now, I don't know what people know about textiles, but we associate textiles with the shittiest parts of capitalism for a reason that's not new.
Yeah, Manchester and Ingalls and shit like that.
Yeah. Born, thank you, Rudolph Born.
Yeah.
Was that after Birth of a Nation? It was right before, actually, but all this is around the same time.
Yeah.
So the progressives do not necessarily oppose this, and particularly because they're so tied to Wilson. This is true at the New Republic. It's true at the Nation even, because Dewey has his whole foray into getting American Marxists back in the liberal consensus. That's what the Nation was designed for. That's part of why Dewey was part of its collaborative board, and all these things sort of happen. Well, what you see in the South is Southern identity is dying during this part. It's also when Southern identity moves, like Southerners, if you look at Kansas or even Georgia prior to the 1940s, the populist movements had strong Southern support. You had populist governors who were often reactionary, but who had strong positions on labor, coming out of the South. I mention this for about 10 years now. Explain to me how William Jennings Bryan, who economically was the most progressive person in the Democratic Party, was literally
the fusion candidate, if you would.
Yeah. I mean, like, he's trying to bridge this. He's trying to get the socialists and the populists back into the Democrats, and also arguing for like money devaluation and stuff like that through changing the metal standards. But he's also he's a radical anti-science person and a fundamentalist. But one of his reasons for being a fundamentalist is he was afraid that Darwinism would lead to the devaluation of black people.
Funny how that worked out.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, but I'm just saying, the logic that we reread even in the early 20th century onto pre-FDR politics is wrong. It's just wrong. You can't understand the progressive and conservative movements by the liberal left and liberal right of today. You really can't before the 1950s, really.
Yeah. How much of this, because I'm reminded of something that I think William Hoagland wrote talking about, I think a piece in, I don't even remember where he wrote it, but he's writing about talking about going against consensus history, but talking about how there was this definite move during the early Kennedy years to go against both reactionary, but also Charles Beard leftist inspired history.
Yeah,
this naive ass liberal.
I think if Kennedy had not been shot, we would consider him the first neoliberal. One of the things he did was lower the marginal tax rates dramatically.
Right. But how much of this era fucks with our own views of history?
Totally does. There's kind of a deliberately rewriting of history. It's not just Nixon doing the Southern strategy. All right, it's also the Democrats trying to erase their own history, which people forget. Until Nixon had completed the Southern strategy, the Democrats had no idea what to do with, because they were maintaining all the segregationist. Hell, I keep on telling people this, but like in Georgia, the Dixiecrats never lost. They just changed parties in 2000 and 2001. They literally flipped their D to R resignations, and a lot of them died in office.
I thought that was more of a 1948 thing, but yeah.
No, I mean it happened. It happened the first time in 1948, again in 1961. I mean, there's a reason why Joe Biden will get all gushy-eyed about when Strom Thurmond was still a Democrat. Yeah. That's the 60s and 70s, and then it didn't happen at the state level for local political machines until the 2000s, and there were deals made between the Black Caucus and the outgoing Democrats to give some of the political machine to the Black Caucus, for exchange for keeping progressive votes limited to Black areas.
Was there a difference between all of the Kennedy people versus the Johnson people?
Yes, there was tensions between the Kennedy people versus the Johnson people, and
eventually, because Johnson shows up and that's, I think, because I can remember me being a math. I got one of my undergrad degrees is in aerospace engineering. I can remember, and I actually did go to space camp when I was 13, because I can remember learning about how, I think very early on, that the American space program was Johnson's attempt to do a Marshall Plan on the American South. So that's one of the things that I was always wondering about, is how did all of LBJ's people think about this kind of thing versus all of Kennedy's people, even though there was a lot of overlap.
I think there was a lot of overlap, and I think Johnson's positions were closer to the more traditional progressive FDR wing of the party. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why I do think we don't want to attribute FDR policies to Johnson, even though we tend, and by that I mean things we associate with the New Deal, but are actually part of the Great Society.
Yeah, Great Society.
Because I've pointed out all so much of what people think is New Deal has nothing to do with the New Deal. Yeah. But all these Great Society programs, go ahead.
As they say, the past isn't even past.
Right. As Faulkner says, another good Southerner, right? Yeah. Or a bad Southerner. Actually, he was both a good Southerner and a bad Southerner, depending on the day. But
Yeah, and the amount of mint juleps consumed by
yes,
midday.
and like a diehard anti-racist 1 minute, and then kind of a normal bigot in his private life the next. But that wasn't totally uncommon for Southern progressives either, or progressives in general. Let's be honest. It's like kind of how, even though I don't love the To Kill a Mockingbird, I actually think the release of the first book, actually, it was written,
the rough draft that was published, if you could say.
Yeah, but I think it's more accurate about what Atticus would have been. I mean, like that a lot of those Law and Justice, even Fair Trials for Black People liberals were also diehard racist and Klan members. So
yeah,
they were just the side that believed in the rule of law.
Anyway, go back to rhetorical inflation.
Well, my point about all the Southern stuff, is that you see the rhetoric becoming more and more pronounced at times where it's the least relevant. It becomes a dead identity. There's no politics really attached to it. This is why people don't see any, until very recently. When I was growing up, people saw no inconsistency flying a U.S. and Confederate flag at the same time.
We've brought up Savannah. I was recently in Savannah for my brother's wedding at a place about 8 miles outside of town at a farm/RV park. Upon driving into the place, which again, RV parks, a lot of RVs there, on one of the flagpoles is a Union Jack and a Gadsden flag. So you have the big UK flag underneath that, the little snaky "Don't Tread on Me."
That's funny.
On the same flagpole. That was interesting. That I had to take a picture of.
That's like when I was out here in Utah and saw a Confederate flag on someone's car, and someone was claiming it was local heritage, and I was like,
interesting views of history.
Okay. I mean, yes, there is there. Okay. So one thing people don't know is the territory of Dixie in southern Utah was a slaveholding territory. But it was never part of the Confederacy. And it didn't exist for very long. And it actually wasn't part of the Mormons either. It was like this weird outgrowth of Texas. Can
you flash up Robert's comment real quick? As commenter Robert says, my grandpa had a Confederate flag, a California flag, and an Oklahoma flag in his yard, which is, if that's not a Woody Guthrie song, I don't know what is.
Yeah, that's an Okie from Muskogee. I don't know.
With a long roundabout trip.
Who lives and dies in Dixie, I guess. I find this all very somewhat tedious, but I do want to point out that, like, politically speaking, this whole like neo-Southern, the Southerners are really dominating us narrative that you see from liberals is laughable, actually.
Yeah, there was, God, how much talk was there during the W years of like people talking about how like the presidency was pretty much had become entirely a Southern thing. Yeah, just like for
and I would point out that like W is from Connecticut. He was just he was like, he moved to Texas for political reasons and learned the accent.
HW was from New England, and that's the thing that people forget is that both HW and Barbara Bush were they were on the board of like Planned Parenthood for a while.
Right.
One of the things that I did think was valid from Colin Woodard's American Nations book was pointing out the difference between New England Republicans versus like Sunbelt and like Southern and Texas Republicans. Which is why the father was different from the son, if you will.
Right. Although I would also say that, like, living in Utah and then going back to the South, there's a big difference between Sunbelt Western and Sunbelt Southern too. Like, there's a huge difference. Sunbelt Southern's more authoritarian, like, but also kind of more efficient. Not gonna lie. Way more populist in its rhetoric, way less conciliatory. Some Sunbelt Westerns way more libertarian. They kind of really don't believe in government, and when they do believe in government, it's like good people doing nice things in local communities. So yeah, I mean, I find all this very interesting, and it explains a lot of like the cultural milieu you have to navigate when dealing with these different factions. But I also find that a lot of the times when we're talking about this area, it's like the South is still the poorest area in the United States.
Yeah.
Like
which is, I think, what, Mississippi, Arkansas is still the number 1, number 2.
Yeah. And
gotcha.
yeah, it's still super poor. And then the next poorest area is the Midwest, which is interesting, where you have the most reactionaries, and also where, frankly, all the core of these, like BLM, tennis unions, a lot of left activism comes out of the cities in these areas, because not only are they color, which they are, they've also seen 100 years of shit.
Yep.
Like
Kansas City and St. Louis.
Yeah, Kansas City, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Chicago, all those cities have known nothing but decline in the 20th century. Detroit. I was just wearing my Detroit versus everybody shirt earlier. I visited your home state recently, and was because my partner's from there. And
please say you availed yourself to the local White Castle delicacies while you were there.
I had White Castle and I had Crystals, because I've had neither in a while.
Awesome.
Crystals are still better because I'm Southern and I do have regional loyalty. And in this area, I will only be. This is the only area in which I'm chauvinist, but Southern food is better than the Western food. Fight me on it.
That's the thing. That's the thing about I miss about living in the Pacific Northwest, is that we don't have massive thunderstorms, we don't have fireflies, and we don't have
White Castle.
Also,
and you also don't have a regional ripoff version of White Castle either. You don't have Crystals, so
yeah, and we don't have Waffle House. And goddamn, if not having a Waffle House is a we have IHOP. Like there's an IHOP, like I don't know, like 5 miles that way.
So that fence against civilization.
Yeah,
I mean, I say that I'll eat IHOP out here, but whenever I go back to the South, I deliberately give myself heartburn by going to Waffle House.
Yeah. Ask Ben Burgess about this too. He's got stories about that. But anyway, you want to talk about the mix of Midwest versus Georgia?
Yeah, that's it. Ben and I. My theory that Ben and I are like we're born and split into like I am the dark shadow Ben, because he like went from the Midwest into Georgia, and I've been all over the Midwest, but I'm from the South, and you know.
Have you seen Best of Enemies? Which was the documentary that I helped Ben show to his Patreon crowd.
Yeah,
the whole thing about how God, William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal really were kind of the same kind of dark mirror images.
I wouldn't say that I'm Ben's dark mirror image on the same political spectrum. I'm just on a different end of it. Do you get down with fried okra? I used to grow my own okra here in Utah so I could fry it.
Awesome.
So anyway, I find this interesting because one of the things I've seen as Bernie has faded and as the left in America really doesn't know what to do in terms of Biden, it has no idea. Like we've seen waves of like, Biden's going to save us. Oh no, he's not. Force the vote. Oh, it doesn't matter. I'm going to follow everything that the squad says every 5 minutes. Oh no, never mind. It's not mattering at all one way or the other. And as you've seen that, you've seen, let's have a stupid fight about Stalin one more time. Or, let's debate cancel culture for the 85th time. And some of us will say that it's super important, and other of us will pretend it doesn't exist. Like
just arguments to be had.
Yeah, you mentioned that this is one of the Chrisman points that you agree with, and I actually agree with this. Although I think, I don't. I think there are many things where Chrisman and I really disagree, but so much of this discourse exists to have a discourse about.
Yeah.
Like, it's because we don't have anything to do, and we're not.
It's similarly to pro wrestling. It's almost like a form of kayfabe, of like conjuring up issues over which to justify having matches. And coming up with we okay shit, we need to have we need to have a big title match at WrestleMania, so let's come up with some angle between our two stars that they can fight over through several pay-per-views and several weekly shows until they finally have their big blow-off match at WrestleMania. Again, all leftists really need to understand pro wrestling and kayfabe. I've said this, which is something I've been like staking a lot of my own minor reputation for years. That, yeah, this. I need a podcast. Little Toaster said, I need a podcast on how to organize in reality. Check out the Rebel Steps podcast out of, I believe, Vancouver. It is done by a couple anarchists up there, but there's a lot of great, like 101 stuff up there. Very, very basic 101 stuff that I think is extremely useful for a lot of people. And I think a lot more people need to be putting out 101 basic how-tos on this stuff, because
there's way too many how-tos on theory, honestly. I mean, this is a person who does theory all the time, but
well, I mean, not just like theory, but it's always like how-tos on just like basic, like talking to people and like how to form, not just like, well, I mean, as you said when you came on my show 4 years ago, it's like leftists need to read more history than theory, which is, growing increasingly true. But yeah.
Oh, yeah. You're absolutely right, Jeremy. In fact, I mean, one of the points, Michael Brooks and I have many disagreements in his life, but we both actually agreed that we needed to write like self-help for Marxist. Not because we believe in the self-help industry, because I don't, but I am like, read Robert Greene's Rules of Power. Don't buy into the ideology of them, but understand how people work and use personal power. Like, you need to know it, even if you're not going to do it that way. I actually think following all of Robert Greene's Rules of Power is a good way to like fail. But each one of them can be useful. I also think that part of the problem with left culture, be it call out culture, which I think is more an apt thing than cancel culture for a variety of reasons. Is one of the interesting things about these rhetorical inflation debates. Call out culture came also from a time in which the left was growing in popularity, but also, even though we had an ostensibly left-wing Democratic president, had no real recourse to power at all. And that kind of led to Bernie, honestly. But it also came from a time where a lot of debates were trying to reestablish and reset limits within the left-wing community that have been dormant for a long time, and with people who were taking standards and practices that came out of academia, but have been mass distributed now through blogging. Decontextualized often. People blame Tumblr, but it really started before Tumblr. It started with LiveJournal.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, LiveJournal was not as toxic as Tumblr could be about it, but I could trace, like, I remember having some of these debates in 2005, 2006 about like how you talk about.
Oh, hey, Grimlock's here.
There's no clue as to where this has gone so far. Yeah. It's gone all over the place.
Yeah.
I have really lived up to my reputation about like Derick makes a point, talks about something tangentially related in history for 15 to 20 minutes that may or may not actually support his point, and then goes back to his first point.
Yeah, it's hey folks, you bought that ticket, you know what kind of a ride you were in for.
Yeah, I teach discursively and tangentially. What I will say, though, to get back onto the topic for a second, is that this whole cancel culture debate, I think it was interesting that the Harper's letter came out when it did, which was when there was a lull between the end of the BLM stuff and it being recuperated by the media. And you started seeing people getting rich off of it, frankly.
Yeah. Harper's Letter was that June or July?
That was July. It was like end of June, July. And I'm like, it's a perfect time when things are stalled.
Yeah.
To bring this shit back up again. Because the Harper's Letter, well, how do you feel about it one way or the other, had nothing to do with the shit that had happened for the past 6 months. Like,
yeah.
Like, I'll be honest with you, that was a time period. I was talking to Ben Burgess about this actually privately, and I was like, look, during the period from right before COVID to right after BLM, none of us talked about cancel culture. And that's when it also moved from being kind of an inter-left debate where right-wingers sort of picked up on it to being like, now they use it to label anything they dislike. And I find that fascinating. I was talking about, the problems of call out and canceling in 2014, right? But I was also warning people that, like, a lot of people who are more successful at canceling are the right, and they don't ever get talked about. Like, I don't like what Sui Park did over the cancel code bill. I thought it was totally decontextualized. And when I've heard liberals talk about it, they actually don't talk about what the racist joke was actually aimed at doing, what the point was. Like, they cut all that out. They also don't mention how much money Sui Park was making off of it. Like, she was bragging. Yeah, she was bragging that she was making like $20,000 a month doing diversity trainings.
Christ, and Patreon money.
Right. What happened to her, though, is really fucking tragic. So she starts getting all these death threats and starts getting shut out herself.
Yeah.
And she basically becomes a weirdo church lady.
Really? That part I did not hear. That's
I mean, a progressive weirdo church lady, but she
Wow. Yeah.
So what my point at the time, and I didn't know all this at the time, but I was just like, look, the counseling problem is ridiculous on the internet. And from a person observing from another country, it looks like a way big deal. Because I was watching from Mexico. I wasn't here on the ground, but I was like, I suspect the right's going to actually get away with actually canceling people better, because they always do. Like, I remember in the 90s, they wouldn't shut up about PC culture, and then immediately after 9/11, like, who actually got shit canceled? It was right-wingers, and they successfully did it.
Yeah, it went from I'm just the two things that are popping up in my mind is both freaking out about PC culture, just that is because my parents had a subscription to Newsweek, so I remember that Newsweek cover about like thought police in like in like this gray bold thick text, but also and then fast forward 10 years later in terms of like right wing canceling and freaking denunciation and ostracism, because I'm gonna make an oath not to say the word cancel culture, but call it like ostracism and denunciation, but just them going after the Dixie Chicks, and to the point where that it didn't exactly kill their career, but it damaged it hard.
Right. I listened to what is it? It's one of the liberal shows I actually like. You're Wrong About. Those guys are kind of good stuff. They do good work, actually, even though
they're not totally liberal, but they're I mean, they're not full on left, but they're good work. They do good work.
I mean, Sarah Marshall's an anti-capitalist, but I think also like what that means to her is not particularly clear.
Yeah. Sarah's also she's also a Portlander, I believe.
Yep, she is. But I'm not. I don't want to like have all my left squad go after them, because I actually sincerely enjoy their show.
Yeah, their show is worthwhile, folks. If you can check their show out, called "You're Wrong About," especially the episodes they will do about shit like the Satanic Panic, which Sarah is writing a book about.
Sarah actually, she actually did say, it was interesting. She pushed back on the narrative that the cancel culture isn't real. But she also said it was so unimportant, and it really is really only an anxiety of media figures, which I kind of think is true. I think it's a real anxiety for media figures. And I also think, ironically, she has noted that it really only works on people who are sincerely left adjacent.
Yeah.
Like, if you try to cancel someone who's actually right wing, you just made their career for them, and then they can fake how much you canceled them and write it. You know, they bring up how much, like, Christina House Summers has done this. She's done this though for like 30 fucking years. Like, I remember her doing this in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Is she did this I'm reading, what the hell am I reading? I think I'm reading Andrew Hartman's book on the culture wars, because Andrew gets into for those of you who have both listened to my own show, Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person, but also has seen Andrew's interview on This Is Revolution. He wrote a great book that has recently been updated, and she became based mom. And so she's still around, you know, much like how fucking Charles Murray comes back. Christina Hoff Sommers comes back as now like this kind of like based mom character for the alt-right idiots.
Yeah, I mean, she's always been able to do that, and she always still claims that she's like actually really a leftist, blah blah blah. But they've gone to, she's claimed that for like 40 years.
Yeah,
like, you know, when I was a paleo conservative, I used to read her like and take it seriously, and the only point she ever made that hit was about schools, and that is how schooling has like negative success rate for boys. And that's actually true, by the way. Like, boys and men tend to do better in STEM-based fields, but they're such a small percentage of who does well in school that it actually doesn't wash out. But the weird issue is like, well, she's like, we need to focus on culture about boys. But weirdly, when I was in ed, liberals took her arguments on that seriously and nothing else, because they had actual data to support it. Like, my liberal teachers were like, yeah, we do have a problem with the education of boys, even though higher education, particularly as you go up further and further, becomes more and more masculinized. And that the leadership of schools is still largely male. I like Very Bad Wizards has come up. Her stepson does a very good podcast, Very Bad Wizards. They actually plugged me once when I was talking shit about Neil deGrasse Tyson. So
what's the show about?
It's basically moral psychology stuff. They do they skirt the line. They try to be the woke anti-woke. I don't know how to say like that any clearer than that. But they do stuff on moral psychology and then philosophy and psychology together. It's very analytic, very social psychology based, but they're not stupid people at all. And actually the podcast is quite enjoyable. They're left liberals.
Well, that helps.
You know, they're not bad. But every now and then they do talk about annoying student moral panics. But then they talk about how that's really only an elite university problem, which, again, I think that's what I would say too. I'm like, yeah, I mean, people at Amherst are always weird. Like,
and have always been weird. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's communists that teach a bunch of super privileged kids. That's also true at Brown. But that's not the experience of even most college students. So, anyway.
Yeah, well, real quick, I need to take a quick break. Can you solo for a minute?
I can solo for a second. Jeremy will go away. Bye, Jeremy. All right, so now you have my giant head. Oh wow! As soon as Jeremy drops away, we hit our highest numbers. I'm going to take this second to talk about the future of Varn Vlog, because I'm kind of, during July, I'm going to overproduce a lot for you guys. He was too quiet. I don't have control over the mix with this operating software. It basically equalizes it out. That's a lot of why actually I do a whole lot of stuff for the podcast and post-production, where I have a lot of sound and volume equalizers put on, because this streaming software doesn't really have a mixer that I can control. Yeah, I can control my mix, but not his. Okay. Anyway, So, and we're losing listeners. Where is Varnblog going? So I've been saying I'm going to do more cultural stuff. I think that's going to start. I'm actually planning on doing some stuff on Appendixin and RPGs. I'm planning on doing some stuff on high art movies. I'm planning on hot seat, choose Varnblog or Pop the Left for Patreon support. I get the money for Varnblog. I would never tell someone not to support Pop the Left. But I get the money from Varnblog directly. And Jeremy's back. All right.
Hang on. Am I still low, or do I need to?
You sound good to me, but how do you sound to everybody else?
Hey, everybody, can you hear? How does that sound? Or do I need to jack up my Do I need to jack up the volume there?
Oh, and now you're loud.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Stalker. Solaris review was interesting. I've done podcasts on Stalker, actually, just not for former people. If you check out Satirian Review. We're slowly going through, in a course of about 5 years, all the Tarkovsky movies. I have now done Nostalgia, Stalker, Solaris, Andrei Rublev. I have yet to do Mirrors, which is Shalom Bantine's favorite Tarkovsky movie, and another couple that I haven't done yet. But I've done most of the major ones over there at Sectarian Review. I didn't do them for Former People because Former People has been defunct for 5 years until we tried to bring it back, and no one supported it.
Former People, I don't think I actually listened to, because I think you stopped that before I was listening to a lot of like Left Pods. So
Former People also wasn't originally a Left Pod. Former People was like me and a Catholic talking about art. So it was actually quite interesting.
A Catholic, Lord,
but like a fairly traditionalist Catholic.
a former,
yeah.
There's a radio show, Varn and the Tradcath in the morning from
it was actually
from 5 to 12.
It's actually somewhat the opposite of me. He was a Marxist who became more and more Catholic, and I am a former paleo conservative who's become more and more radical over time. But we didn't talk about social stuff. And Doug Lane was involved with Former People for a brief while until I asked him to leave, and we're just not going to talk about that.
Right.
So we don't mention the many denunciations of Doug and Varn.
Yeah, we don't talk about that in polite company.
As a funny, we're totally off topic about rhetorical inflation, but actually this is an example of rhetorical inflation. Doug and I were fighting over something that had nothing to do with anything, and then we started arguing about Hegel, and we used that as a justification for cutting ties.
I have been at a table in a bar in a restaurant where the two of you talk, and god damn, it does sound like two people who, two old high school friends review, looking back over 20 years of both high school, talking about high school shit, and god damn if it's not like old revived high school arguments and shit.
Yeah, I mean, it is a lot like that. Although I didn't know Doug until I was 30, so but yeah, I mean, a lot of it had to do with a lot of the stuff around Occupy, and Doug and I going in different ways around it. Doug became more and more of a Marxist humanist. I became more and more of a left communist, and we were fighting over how Pop the Left was being edited to make me more copacetic to MHI. And
wow, then seems extreme to when I edit, I just take out ums and uhs. I don't edit for
yeah, there's lots of editing for content with Varn and Doug stuff. So that actually stopped with Pop the Left because we live streamed it. And so Pop the Left is not edited nearly as much anymore. Marxist Humanist Initiative, and that's all I'm going to say about it because I've already done denunciations of me.
That's what MHI stood for those of you listening in.
Yeah, see, Jeremy is the professional here, and you guys should listen to his podcast. It doesn't get enough love. I'm going to go ahead and say that right now. I've noticed you've been able to get yourself back into production lately. Ironically, even though you have less time.
Yeah, that's well, I went from being unemployed for most of last year to being employed again, and that's that was one of the ironies of when a lot of because so many media types are talking about the threat of quarantine is like, oh hey, everybody's gonna be at home, so like those of you hey, all you other media types, you'll finally have a chance to write that novel that you'll be talking about, or you'll write your own version of King Lear and shit. And turns out no, being unemployed or being stuck at home during the middle of a mass pandemic with mass death fucking everywhere, where you can't go out and you can't see your friends and you can't go to the diner or the movie theater, is not so good for your creative outlet. And funny how that works.
Who knew?
Yeah, who knew?
I mean, honestly, similarly, Jeremy, I mean, I will say that that I also had trouble with that. I wrote a book right before COVID, and finished it off during the first month of the pandemic. And I'm like, I'm going to do so much writing. I'm writing a book from Christopher Lasch. I did do so much reading for that book. I did do that. And I talked with my co-author and we rewrote the introduction 5 times and then realized, like, why are we starting with the introduction? We haven't finished the book yet, or even all of the research. And no, I've found that I'm more productive the more work I have, weirdly. That does lead me into spirals of overwork, as people have noted. Because the people well, how do you have a day job and then show up on more podcasts than people who do it professionally? And I'm like, I don't know. I have compulsion problems, and probably should go out more, spend more time with my partner and my dog.
Well, to be fair, when did you finally adopt your fun basset hound?
Oh, my basset hound was adopted about during the middle of, I guess, around January.
I was gonna say, because you've only had that one around for a few months, so it's not like you had to spend most of you had to work it into your life back during last year. Also, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, check out Derick's post on social media. He has an adorable basset hound, and I still hold the basset hound being the best of all dogs.
Well, my basset hound is definitely the best of all dogs. He's silent. Guys, you don't know. Maybe I can show him to you. There we go.
Podcast buddy.
He's always down. 90% of the time that I'm down here, he is pretty close, sleeping nearby. He doesn't bark. He's like the quietest dog ever. I know you guys are totally signed in to listen to me talk about my cute hound dog, but I totally have a cute hound dog that I got during COVID. He keeps me sane. And he keeps my partner Kristen sane. So it's pretty good. Mine is half basset. We think half either beagle or harrier hound because his ears are too short. He's a little bigger than he should be for a basset, but he also is not quite as droopy. But he's still pretty great. Best dog ever.
That's one of the disappointing things that COVID took from us is not only were these canceled last year, I think I found out recently they were canceled this year. In Oregon, originally they were called the Basset Olympics, but I think they probably got a cease and desist. So they're now switched to the Basset Games, where I think these happen in different states, but there's definitely little, every July, there would be little Basset Hound meetups in a park just south of Portland, where one of the most gloriously ludicrous experiences you could ever have is to be in a park with like 40 to 60 basset hounds, like competing in events like best howl or best costume, or they tried to lead them through a little like obstacle course that of course the most of the dogs don't really feel the need to complete. And yeah, it's it'll bring a tear to your eye how beautiful it is.
All right. So, as far as rhetorical inflation, you want to talk about rhetorical inflation? We need the same China conversation. I agree. All sides of the China discourse right now make me kind of icky. Like we've gone out of the realm of like reasonable criticism, where you almost sound like you're passing off State Department propaganda, but also when people aren't doing that, they seem to be sounding like they're literally on the payroll of the CCP's business association.
Yeah.
So like
what the fuck are you people? Yeah.
It's like, can't you have like critical support or talk about all the struggles in China, talk about there is real problems going on in nation building projects, and China is very much engaged in the high period of one. There's all kinds of things we talk about, but we can't talk about them honestly right now because the rhetoric around China is super heated, and like it makes me feel weird about dealing with certain things that I know for a fact, because I lived in Asia for so long. I've actually devoted a lot of time to studying China. I've known a lot of people who were professional sinologists. One of my best friends in Korea was a professional sinologist, and I don't feel like I can have an honest conversation about China without accidentally giving one side or another that I don't want to have a talking point.
Yeah.
And if and honestly, I'd slightly rather have the pro-China side have a talking point, but they also get so ludicrous on their claims that I don't really know what to do. And I partly think that's because, again, we're in a time period where China's done pretty well in regards to its COVID response. Its economy is doing better than the West, but it's not doing as good as it historically was. And that's still it's not something people are dealing with. They're like, 6% growth is great. I'm like, but 6% growth, it's the same as the West in the 60s. And we are about at the same historical time point. I kind of think, nation state projects are just kind of bad to begin with, but I don't want to encourage like xenophobia or and when we're dealing with nation states as they currently exist, frankly, you want normalization of U.S.-China relations. You really do.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's irresponsible to advocate anything other than that. And yeah, I think someone saying Cuba's pretty cool, and that's about it. I tend to like post Fidel Castro Cuba a lot. And even Fidel's late period wasn't too bad. There's some iffy stuff in the 80s, and the 70s, but
they weren't necessarily that good with their queer populations for a while.
Yeah.
But to his credit, I mean, Fidel did apologize for that and said like he was much more worried about. Well, I think his comments on it were that he was busy trying not to be killed by Americans, and he kind of like overlooked that particular part. So
yeah, sure.
But it's not like, I guess during the same period it's not like here in America we treated our queer and trans population that well, given when certain epidemics started.
But LOA edition, what are they talking about?
Anyway. I do not know.
Okay. What are your thoughts on democratic centralism? What version of it? I heard you talk about it with Tom Brown, an episode about the Manera book, but I don't quite get it. Democratic centralism is generally that you are allowed to express your dissenting opinions within a political group, but when the democratic vote is cast, you follow the majority. I think all at a basic principle level, all democracies are centralist like this. I actually think that's just the way democracy works. However, democratic centralism as interpreted even by the SPD, and so we can't blame this on the dirty Leninists. This is in the DNA of the SPD, led to the suppression of dissenting opinions so that people didn't know how people in the party actually voted. So, for example, Lenin always accused Kautsky of voting for war credits. That's not true. We didn't know that for a long time, however, because the documents of the vote were not released, even though they were recorded, for democratic centralist reasons, because they did not want to show dissension with the party norms. And that actually split the party. So what has happened with democratic centralism in the past is this ban that's usually used to lead to a ban on factions. All right. That's what it actually ends up doing most of the time. And that's bad. It leads to two things. In the Trotskyist, and sometimes the left com scenario, it leads to people splitting over minor differences over and over and over again because you cannot in good conscience stay with the majority of the group because you can't express your dissenting opinion, so you must split. In the case of Socdem and Stalinist orgs, it leads to purges. In the Socdem case, it leads to unofficial purges and shunning. And in the Stalinist case, well, I mean, purges is a lot more literal. Because you cannot have factions develop. What that tends to actually do is mean that there's a de facto faction in control, purging all the other factions. And that faction doesn't actually have majority support. It just has a polarity of support, and no other faction can approach it. And it tends to also be stultified. So you see this in Trotskyist and Stalinist parties, where because of the centralist and because of open voting, you have the same people democratically in charge in perpetuity.
Can you comment on Demcent as a thing of, say, modern Western US UK leftist groups that are still holding to that, and how that manifests?
It's largely irrelevant to modern Western political parties, except for the fact that it keeps a small cadre and sectarian organizations in control. Okay. Demcent bans tend to be a relic of anti-communist periods. However, I will also say that democratic centralists within non-democratic centralist organizations tend to lead to splits. So there is a non-anti-communist reason to be wary of them. But I've always found it interesting, for example, in the DSA, right now there's an invocation of anti-Demcent rules against the Trots, but not against Stalinists.
Mm-hmm. That's true, but how many? I will say, how many Stalinists do we have joining? Joining the evil Socdems that are the idiots like me in DSA.
Plenty. The FRSO took over a lot of the Utah chapter of the DSA.
Oh wow! That's different.
So there's a lot more than you think. Also, Bhaskar Sankara did argue for a popular front with Stalinists included, but with the Socdems in charge this time, which Charlie Post wisely advised him was probably not smart. So, I mean, if people read those debates, Bhaskar is good about publishing all that stuff openly. I'm not particularly worried about the DSA banning factions, because the moment it did so, it would immediately fall apart.
No comment on that one. Me being a still active DSA.
Yeah, you're a dirty roser.
Yeah, that's how it goes. Well, we're at 90 minutes. One last thing, that I think I did want to ask about, because the topic is still ostensibly rhetorical inflations in declining states. In terms of rhetoric, can you talk about class reductionism, both as
Yes.
a concept, but more importantly, how it is used and weaponized. Because and this is one of those things what I think talking to Freddie DeBoer is probably worthwhile, because Freddie has written about critique creep and how these these what were once useful terms, once they hop from academia into social media, kind of get vulgarized and spread apart and ground down to meaninglessness. So
yeah, class reductionism was a critique of the classical CPUSA's position, even though they also did a lot of anti-racist work, that you would have to subsume racial interest to class interest. This was even a bigger deal in the SPA, where there was a lot more explicit chauvinist factions. One may even say proto-Nazbol and right populist factions within the SPA itself.
SPA, what era are we talking about?
Early 20th century, so like 1910s.
Okay, yeah.
Debs actually pushes back on a lot of this explicitly. So like Debs follows the Second International line about opposing jingoistic socialism, which was the phrase used at the time. But they didn't kick those people out. They just made sure they didn't dominate the leadership. Class reductionism right now tends to be workerism, which I actually do think is a problem, but it's not actually class reductionism. That is taking workerist lifestyle points and valorizing them as if it was an essential trait of the working class, and an essential trait of the proletariat. And a lot of times, actually, that's like just blue collar shit, and also kind of anachronistic. I do think that's a problem. And that's something that I used to talk about class reductionism about. But I actually, ironically, and I say this a lot and people don't get the joke, it's not class reductionist enough. However, what I have seen is people saying that people who have a class first analysis of, say, race are denying racial disparities and whatnot. And I'm like, how would anyone who had an honest analysis of, say, the way class intersects with race not acknowledge that generational debarment from the acquisition of even proletarian wealth through slavery, and then political debarment from even proletarian levels of quasi property ownership or participation in the formal economy through Jim Crow is not class related or racialized. Like, if someone did that, they're fucking morons. And very few people do. There are a few people on the anti-left socialists who actually do make such claims. I think they're nationalists, and I think we should call them for that. I don't think calling them class reductionists is particularly helpful, because it's not even a class reductionist analysis. It's more of a cultural workerist one. And so what you have, and I actually think there's a converse to this in the PMC debates, frankly, is a culture war being fought under faux class terms. And so it can be easily weaponized for liberals to shut class discussions up, or to flatten them out.
Yeah.
Conversely,
I would say somebody talked about how the social media flattens all distinctions and all contexts. It's at some point it just becomes either or. It can't be a gradient. But please continue.
Yeah. A DSA NPC member called Fred Hampton, quoted from Hampton, was called class reductionist. Well, I mean, Fred Hampton would have been actually probably tarred as a class reductionist given some of what he said. Can you tell how someone like Adolf Reed's writing interviews of class reductionism are imprecise, etc.? I think one of the issues with Adolf Reed is he has a more precise definition of PMC than Barbara Ehrenreich or most of the people on the left who use it. He actually means specifically people with a fiduciary responsibility who aren't petit bourgeois, but are also not part of either the productive social circuit or, I mean, he means people like doctors and financial advisors and very high level management, not even common middle management like you're dealing with.
Whereas Barbara Ehrenreich, when asked about this, about what she meant by the phrase or the term, just as she said, she just was referring to snooty professionals, which that tracks.
The Superstructure podcast made something like Varn's PMC workers in comparison. I think there is a mutual exchange between the radical humanities MMT versus and Varnland, even though I think our economics are sometimes copacetic and sometimes diametrically opposed. Adolf Reed said we should give up on the DSA. Well, I mean, if Reed says it.
It was like, I don't know, dude. Biggest org we got right now. So,
but that, in a way, though, you have a problem. You have a problem that like your biggest org is still fucking tiny. Yeah. The rhetorical inflation games and all factions of the DSA has just escalated. You would tie this back in, but it really is like the class reductionism versus, wokeism accusations have just gone up. The calling people ultra leftist. There are people in relatively high up in the DSA calling fucking MMTers ultra leftist. What the hell? Like, that's insane.
Okay.
You have people talking about mutual aid being an ultra left activity because it's not politically relevant, while also ignoring the fact that's most of what the DSA actually does.
Yeah, we're out here. Yeah, I guess just to speak for Portland DSA, the amount of shit we've done for, I don't know, wildfire supplies and helping people. Fuck, we had it was 115 degrees on Sunday in Portland. Not to mention all what everybody else and all the other groups up and down the West Coast have been trying to do to cope with this shit. It's like, yeah, shut the fuck up. But
yeah, I mean, so who the thing is, anybody can find. You can find someone in the DSA saying there are people in the DSA who are communizers. I mean, like. Because it's still so large and it's so clearinghouse, and I refer to it as our sectarian clearinghouse organization. Right? Yeah. There's people in the DSA, even probably people close to the national, who hold positions that you can tackle on anything. The issue the DSA has is that the national eats up a disproportionate amount of its funds.
No comment.
Most of whom go to paid staffing, which they need, and to consultants, for which we don't really know what they're using them for. I'm guessing I'm going to get no comment on that, but that's from the DSA's own records that you can find if you look on their Patreon. I don't know why they make it so hard to find. It is public, but it is not easy to find. But the last issue that they have is that their dues are probably too low. I know that's maybe a controversial position. I like keeping dues low, but if you literally have to keep your paid staff, which to be fair, most of it is not paid very high, is so much of your proportion of your national budget, and you don't really have a lot to do anything. So locals have to turn over their own fee structures in addition to what you're charging nationally, but it's wildly inconsistent from chapter to chapter. You have a serious problem.
Yeah.
Also, the DSA caucuses, who even knows what they even do? I mean, they represent ideological tendencies, but what actual effect they have on the DSA national is unclear to me. And I'm studying the structure of the DSA. I find that I'm learning more than most DSA members learn. Jeremy also, tolerates the fact that I will always talk shit about, usually the major left-wing org. I do not chastise people for being involved in it, nor do I tell people to become involved in it. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that right now I have no idea how the DSA can possibly function aside from the Democrats. I know there are people in the DSA who want to, even in the DSA national who want to, but their means of doing so without splitting the DSA back into the sectarian factions that already existed.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. Rotary clubs may do more charity work than the DSA. I mean, to be fair, DSA locals do a lot, but they do it on their own dime.
Yeah.
And
also Rotary clubs pull from a as I say this as someone who actually looked into what the fee structure for the local Rotary club was, and like, wow, I am really not employed well enough to be a member of that. But before we get too far into DSA criticism land, one of the things, just to finish up on the class reductionist take, one of the things I want to ask because I'm always interested in I don't know, psychological or functional questions, is what function is the slam of class reductionists serving? Like, what work is that doing, or like what role is that, why has it been weaponized, and what, in what role does it do?
It serves to be able to call someone adjacent to white supremacists without saying so. Because Workerist Institute, I saw this today. I'm going to shit on the NEA for a second because I'm in it. The NEA had a leading survey that was clearly put out to decide if its membership was conservative or liberal in race. And it asked things for, do you think poverty is the biggest driver of educational inequity / not race, basically? And do you think racism is a problem in America? And how do you feel positively and negatively about each of the races? And it asked that to a fucking union.
That's that seems a bit seems a bit much.
But it was clearly leading into we have two narratives, and you're going to accept either the Democratic and then like its political options. Are you liberal, very liberal, conservative, very conservative, or independent, whatever that means? So Will's here. So it's a clearly leading thing, and I had no idea. Like, I had trouble responding to it because, like, of course I think race is a driver of inequity in education. I fucking teach. Right. But I also think poverty is not the only correlation. It's not, but it's actually a bigger one than race. Unless you think that race alone is a cause of poverty. Because roughly the success rates of racial groups tie into their relative wealth, in society. And so how do you disaggregate that? And I also think leading people about your positions about specific racial identity groups is like asking people to adopt a more racialized and probably racist framework. So not great at all. Because it also puts it where, like, what is the NEA's job? To be anti-racist or to support the workers? And I'm like, well, you support the workers by being anti-racist, but like, don't put this as a binary where I have to choose between the two. And and literally one of them is in your job description, and one of them is kind of part of it, but not. Like, what do you think you're going to get from this? So I can't tell if the NEA is trying, and there's a national survey trying to justify a more conservative term on race, or trying to justify adopting a Biden narrative, or both at the same time, depending. I have no idea. So what does class reductionism really do? I mean, it serves a lot of functions. I also think, though, conversely, and I know this made you uncomfortable, I think a lot of people who hear the class reductionist moniker and respond to it actually will sometimes adopt reactionary points of view because it's also called class reductionist. I think it becomes a mutually constitutive identity category.
For example,
the bellows.
Oh,
I think there's a lot of people who I knew who had fairly innocent and innocuous views about class who started getting into bellows bullshit after they got called class reductionist. I do not think it was something they thought before that. The idea that, and this is one of these things about mutually constitutive identity categories and rhetorical inflation, is it has an effect on both sides. Eventually people tend to become what you're calling them. The same is true, by the way, with shit libs and talking about shit libs all the time, is it actually encourages shit lib behavior. Like, I don't do that. I don't do it for a reason. I don't throw class reductionism out. I don't talk about wokeism either. And I don't talk about like shit libs all the time because they're mutually reinforcing identity categories. They're a way to fight a culture war while pretending you're doing something else.
Yeah. And they reify a lot of bad shit.
Yeah. Yeah. Bellows is just Coolette light. I would not even go that far. I think sometimes they're way more pernicious than Coolette is, frankly. You kind of know what Coolette is up to.
Plus, they're not Canadian.
Yeah. It must be Cointelpro. You know what? I would love to believe, guys, that all left idiocy was actually the State Department. But one, I know how bureaucracies work. They're not that good. And two, I know a lot of you guys. You're not paid by the feds. Now, here's the thing that I'm going to say. I think left groups, if they ever got more important like they were in the 70s, and this is one of the reasons why I kind of push back on people on the current left narrative being like a super big threat to contemporary power, is you're not infiltrated like they were in the 60s and 70s yet. I bet there are feds in every group, you know, but I also think they probably don't matter. They're probably not doing very much. They're probably just keeping notes. Yeah,
I was gonna say the at a certain point is like that's part of the issue with Cointelpro being, I don't want to say so popularized, but because it became a thing, so it became this almost like a scapegoat of like, oh shit, you know, hey, our leftist group would have been working just fine had it not been for those meddling feds, and not realizing that, like, hey, wait a minute, maybe there are certain tendencies among leftist groups, because one of those things that I don't think we emphasize, we talk about, is because capitalism immiserates people, so therefore, and as a result of that, miserable people will want to fight back against that. It's kind of a thing of like, or similarly with like traumatized people, is that you'll have a lot of like traumatized people who might not have fully processed their immiseration and their trauma but they really will want to do the work, and some of the bad habits and the bad coping mechanisms kind of like, haven't really been dealt with, and show up doing the work, so that become, like, the feds don't have to do shit. They just have to, like, just step back and let, certain natural processes, play out, and and like clockwork, the group will destroy itself.
I was about to say the only exception to that, when I looked at all the Cointelpro stuff from the 60s, were the American Nazi Party and the Black Panthers. I think you're right about that. Like, if you read the book Heavy Radicals, and its sequel, one is put by Zero Books, the other is by Repeater Press, so I'm not just plugging my press here. My press, I don't own fucking Zero, but the press I work for. Those books, even though they try to make an argument the RCP was crawling and feds then brought it down, their actual proof is basically the CPUSA and the RCP were infiltrated by the feds, and all they did was push people to make public distinctions that they were saying privately, or tried to bait them into violent acts.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is the best sign if someone's a Fed if they're trying to get you to do something really stupid aggressive. Like,
which I think as limited as Judas and the Black Messiah was as a film and depicting this stuff, I think does show up in this film, because later on in the film, when the Ryan O'Neal character encounters like other Panthers who were Feds, like who were encouraging the shit. So
yeah, I actually thought that movie did an okay job of it. What I thought I didn't like is when it portrays informant too ambivalently, but I think actually a bigger deal. It underplays how much the drug trade and culture was complicating what the Panthers were doing. That was why they couldn't tell a lot of who was getting killed by whom for what.
Well, also the fact that everybody in the film was all the actors in the film were portraying real life people a decade to 15 years younger than the actors themselves were.
Yeah, that's also, there's that problem. There's I think another problem in that movie is like they kind of touch on it, on the drugging of Hampton, but they don't go into how bad it was, because a lot of the Panthers actually talk about that was the Feds was all the drugs flowing through the area. That's how they were able to get their informants in, and their poison in, literally in this case. And the other thing that it kind of ignores is Aoki, because it makes the left look real bad.
But Aoki was San Fran, wasn't he? Or
yep, he was, and it's different. But it's actually the Feds were also crawling in the Panthers' gun accusations. That the Feds were feeding them guns as a pretext to clamp down on them. They didn't do that to other left groups. So I mean, this is one of the things that like tells you how scary they really found the Panthers, because with the RCP, there was a person shot with the RCP by a local cop when the Feds actually backed away from it. And it looks like the Feds, also Pascal was right that they don't talk about how much money is flowing through all that. They only kind of bring it up as a side point in the end, but it was a lot of money. But
in 1969 dollars, yeah.
But I will also say that what of the portrayals of the Panthers I've seen in movies, and there's been a bunch. There was a bunch this year. It was the least shitty. Like,
the performances were great. The cinematography was great,
and it didn't lie a lot. Like, it kind of lied, but it didn't lie a lot. Which, I mean, like, what was the Panthers in the Aaron Sorkin? Oh my god, like, that movie.
No comment on that because I have not actually seen the film, but that's a thing for Jason and Pascal to comment upon. Yeah.
A correction. Alfred said we should give up on the left. Ed Alfred suggested that we should not place on. This is after it's here or after hours on Tuesday.
You really you have to leave if it's a comment that's like 20 words, you do have to leave that up on screen for at least a couple seconds. You can't.
All right. Whatever.
Thank you.
All right.
Basic production tips.
What does that mean? I mean, when Adolf Fried says abandon the left, that motherfucker still voted for Hillary Clinton. Publicly.
I don't know. I don't know. It's
I mean, I actually respect Adolf Fried, but when I say, like, I get mad when we see stuff like this, and I'm like, but like, you're not even asking us to leave the Democrats. Like, what do you want us to do?
What is I can't remember his name. What's Shuja Hader's older brother name? Wrote the book, starts with an A.
Assad Hader?
Yeah, Assad Hader, because like Assad has in several interviews over the last couple of years has talked about the one thing to remember about Adolf Fried's writing is that Adolf he's been trapped in academia for a long ass time, and that might have like colored some of his thinking in terms of like who he's pushing back against. So
I feel that happened with Christopher Lash for sure, and he said something similar about abandoning the left. But also, he was talking about the '80s Democratic left explicitly and made that clear.
Slight difference, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, man. I mean, like, look, I used to take the left communist stance that we should abandon the left of capital too, till I really thought about it. And like, well, who's not the left of capital now? Like, seriously. And I need to know who Adolf Reed means by that. It does sound an awful lot like "She Who Will Not Be Named" talking points, and we shall always refer to her as that because I don't want to deal with that shit.
Yeah, Cthulhu/Voldemort. Also, Eric, about Sorkin writing a Panther movie. Sorkin wrote the Chicago 7, should have been Chicago 8, but he changed it. Film, and he also licensed. I mentioned this documentary before. Sorkin licensed the story of Vidal versus Buckley, the 1968 story. He licensed that story to write a film about it. And I don't think he ever did. So it goes.
I mean, one thing I'll say is, if your idea of the left is the academic left, and that's who you're engaging with, those people are awful. I'm not gonna lie, they are. Like, I've dealt with professors all my life. They can be awful. And honestly, it's not even that they're leftist. It's not even that they're academics. Even it's that the culture of the university in America. You talk about inflation of rhetoric and self-importance to stakes. Yep. Holy shit. However, I think hating on academics is too easy for a lot of this stuff.
But it's fun.
It is fun, but it's too easy. I also think I think it's an easy out. And when someone tells me to give up on the left, but they're still telling us to strategically vote for the Democrats, and they'll also Reed was right when he called out Angela Nagel for being got for, showing up with Malcolm Swayuna on every conservative podcast just to agree with them,
or repeat Tucker appearances, right?
Again, just to agree. I mean, like, even someone who I don't love, like George Cigarillo Mar, people who might remember him from a few years back, was not going on. He went on Tucker, but to argue with them, which I also think is stupid, but at least I can kind of respect it.
Yeah, like a combative stance,
right? Like, I don't know. So I get. So it feels weird for me to not to hear that in out context. I also think, how did Pascal respond to that?
That I don't remember. I can't say. We'd have to ask him.
Oh, maybe he means giving up on the left in the platypus way, which is to do what exactly? Because the platypus way used to be to try to come up with a new left, more like the old left. But
be an asshole contrarian online. I don't know.
But increasingly seems to be, and I said this when I left before the Trump scenario spiked a Rudite edition. I mean, like the reason why I say that is, while there are still a couple of plats I respect, like I do respect Kane Reed Cultus and to some degree Pat Managalis. I don't hate Chris Catrone, but by the logic that they condemn all of the left as being secret Democrats, most of the Platt membership will count as secret Republicans. If they applied the logic consistently to both sides, it actually washes out. If you by their criterion by which they judge a lot of leftists, because they've implied that I was a Democrat, which is wild.
You're from the South, aren't you?
Well, they also implied when I left that I was going to be a neoconservative, which is hilarious. So, you know, whatever. But it's something that it's not. That's not like if their conception of like finding the like they're right that any revolution worth its name would have people in it who we would not consider leftists. That's actually completely true.
Yeah.
But if the idea is we have to tail them to not tail the left's tailing of the Democratic Party, that's if the left's tailing of the Democrats is makes them Democrats, then their tailing of populist right wing would make them Republicans by the same logic. I actually don't hold to that logic, but it's not my argument. I'm just applying their argument across the board. Oh, well then, okay. So this is very different. Thank you, John. If I recall correctly, I think campaigning and reaching out to people who aren't necessarily already thinking of themselves as leftists. Duh. There's a limited capacity of people who think of themselves as leftists. But here's the thing. A lot of these phrases get thrown around in ways where one meaning is absolutely true and reasonable and another meaning is insane. And both critics and,
proponents
can abuse it. Like, I'm sure people who will hear that and think that Reed agrees with she who will not be named. And I don't mean that's just in people who are critiquing Reed, but also people who agree with Reed. This was also a problem with people and Nick Land and Mark Fisher. All right. Because Mark Fisher's rhetoric mirrored a lot of the rhetoric of the cathedral that Nick Land used. And Thang Numina in particular. And like other people, Fisher was inconsistent on whether or not he had an economic or a cultural definition of working class. Some of that I think is a little bit more forgivable in the British context, where there's still a medieval conception of class written into the law.
Plus, yeah. Also, the one thing we always need to remember is that shit over on Turf Island is just weird.
Yeah,
probably always will be.
What even is the left in America? Because it seems like an empty signifier used to lambaste anyone who isn't a chauvinist social democrat. I actually sometimes think so. The left is an open signifier that can mean pretty much whatever the fuck anyone wants it to mean. This is a problem. Like, anarcho-primitist, left or reactionary. What does that even mean? Like, Rosh Wolf and I had a debate where, like, we talked about whether or not jingoist leftism was a part of the left, and I said, well, traditionally it was seen as a right deviation of the left, but it was also seen as one of the dividing lines that you couldn't tolerate.
Yeah, I don't know. Also, we are past 2 hours.
Yeah, let's stop.
It is what the fuck? It's 10:30 West Coast time. So let us.
For those of you on the East Coast, why aren't you sleeping?
A lot of people out of work. I don't know, or it's Thursday night. It's party night. It's still a school night, but a Thursday night you can stay out a little bit later.
This says a friend of mine who's an open Democrat. Was Marx wrong on the lumpen? Okay, I feel as lumpen is the only place where one can be. Try it, see what happens.
That's almost like reviving like Eldridge Cleaver type talk. Anyway,
it is what it is. It's because people think that violent action is the only thing it can mean to be revolutionary. And by the way, where I actually push back on Marx is like lumpen doesn't have a clear definition. When he lists off who counts as lumpen, some of it is like just people I don't like. Honestly. So I would say no. But Marx may not have been all that coherent on what lumpen was. But I will tell you, for working with the homeless a lot, a good damn luck trying to use them as a positive political force, because their needs are so high, and they're real needs, and we need to address them and help them.
Especially especially during fucking heat waves.
Right. But, and so I'm not saying they need to be cut out of the movement. I'm not one of those people who thinks like, oh, if you're a lumpen, you can't ever be a communist. I mean, that's nonsense. But I do think you have to help people not be desperate, and that will probably decrease their alienated militancy. But alienated militancy is not the same thing as being an effective revolutionary or an effective political changer or any of that. Alienated militancy is actually generally a good way to get people and yourself killed. So, or at least in prison.
Yeah, and that's bad. And on that note, let's draw things quickly to a close.
Yes, Jeremy's telling me he's got to sleep. So
I don't have to report to work for another 10 hours. So anyway, but yeah,
I'm off right now.
Yeah, you're in summer holiday.
All right. So, although I still have to work, but anyway,
yeah,
I can just work on my own time. All right. We should also want to help the houseless because they're not. Yeah, I think we should want to help anyone who. I mean, as a side note, if someone's an asshole to drug addicts, to the homeless or houseless, I go back and forth on what nomenclature I think is actually useful. Sometimes I think houseless is a little bit euphemistic-y, but unhoused? I get why they use it.
Unhoused or houseless?
Yeah, unhoused is okay, I guess. Unhome, I don't know. I guess they do have a home, kind of, but I don't like anything that lowers the.
Yeah, if anybody's being an asshole to them, I don't want to say glass their ass, but if you have a spare beer bottle, there are worse targets you could wing it at.
Hey, now you sound like a Fed.
Yeah.
But parody
satire, Minecraft.
Okay, there we go. But is organizing around debt viable?
Yes.
For what? I would say yes, but you have to pivot it into something. I think right now, what I will say is, and that'll be my last. This will be the last topic because it has nothing to do with what we initially started on, but we're obviously in the responding to our favorite hoi polloi. Debt is a severe problem of working class life. However, it will actually help. Debt forgiveness will probably disproportionately go to middle class and upper middle class people. They have more debt. They don't have as much debt as a proportion. And if you means test it by any way, you're going to be hyper unfair. I mean, by means test it with like not forgiving corporate debt or whatever, but
or payday loan debt.
Yeah, anything like that. I think basically, non-corporate debt, particularly to the government, should be forgiven. Any other that should be organized around.
Real quick, that does remind me. If you ever, I think it would be a worthwhile vid for you to talk to like Astor Taylor and her friends in the Debt Collective about like the political economy of debt and fighting back through, holding back on like debt strikes and shit.
Okay.
Anyway, just suggestion.
I will say, however, that debt strikes are less effective than working strikes because they won't shut down capital. They won't. They will not. Like, if all debt was unpaid tomorrow, it would not probably matter that much. Particularly of small debt holders. Because what's actually moving everything is bank-to-bank debt. And I think, but I do think there's a real political economy around that. You can have real power as a consumer by just saying no. I mean, honestly, debt forgiveness programs work this way. Like basically like, I'm not going to pay it. What are you going to do about it? I'll reduce the debt load so you can pay it so we recoup some of our money. That's normally what happens. It's great for the individual. Is it going to shut down capitalism? Absolutely not. Thoughts on Matt Chrisman?
You missed the Discord chat earlier.
Oh my God. I have very complicated thoughts about Mr. Chrisman. But a lot of people want us to have this conversation. And I don't want it to be a debate because in some ways, Matt Chrisman is one of the people in Chapo closer to me than anybody else in Chapo. I sincerely believe that. But I also think where we disagree, we're 180%, 1,000 yards apart. And I often think Matt is way too flippant. It's a rhetorical style thing, and his flippancy will occasionally get him tied up into knots. Own him on the PMC thesis.
That's an entire other show. So yeah, stop asking questions. It's fucking It's 10:30 at night on the West Coast, people. What the hell?
Yeah, for real.
Anyway, I think you're the one in charge of the stream. I think it's time to shut it down. Anyway, thank you folks for tuning in and watching us yak about the shit for 2 hours plus. My name is Jeremy. I host a show called Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person. Derick has been gracious enough to guest on our show.
Usually about once a year, right?
Once a year, yeah. We did a great. God, I think we did a 3-hour conversation on conspiracy theory a couple of years ago that I think everybody should really check out, especially because at one point, the last third of that, we just talk about eco-fascism and the history of eco-fascism because of the fuckhead in Christchurch, and it's worth checking out. And we're not talking about Star Trek. No more Star Trek questions. That's another show. So anyway, but yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Thank you for subscribing. You should all join the Patreon for This Is Revolution. That's all I gotta say. It's like somewhere between $3 and $5.
Yeah. All right. I would say join the Patreon of anyone who's any left podcast that you can join at their lowest membership level, including mine. If you want to give me more money, great, but spread it around. We're basically all buskers here, and
Busker Sankara.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Night.
Night.